Welcome to the Prospective Doctor podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Pre-med and medical students alike are encouraged to tune in each week for tips on how to become a strong med school candidate, gain acceptance into the school of your dreams, and succeed on your journey toward residency and becoming a doctor.
Hi, everyone. We have a very special guest today, Mr. Dave Etler.
Here I am.
So Mr. Dave Etler is the founder, producer, host of the Short Coat podcast, which is a weekly podcast that talks about different topics and gives an inside look into what it's really like to be a med school student. I would like you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what brought you to that field and that journey and what you do.
Sure. So I, got a job here at the Carver College of Medicine as a clerk back in 2002. And, that was fine for many years. But ultimately, I became experienced at my job and was looking for something more interesting that I could do on top of it here at work. So I think it was 2010, I proposed doing a podcast. At the time I was listening to podcasts for the first time and, sort of felt a pull to do one. And I looked around me and I realized I was surrounded by an interesting environment, an interesting place full of interesting people doing interesting things. And I thought, people might want this. People might want to listen to it. So I, proposed it and was lucky enough to have a supervisor who actually thought that was a good idea. And so started it in August of 2010.
Wow. So you've been doing this for a decade.
Yeah. At first, I was sort of doing it as I had time. Mm-hmm. And, if you do it on that sort of basis, you never have time. And then, the original idea was to record interviews with interesting people who came to the College of Medicine. And while that happens, a fair amount, it doesn't happen every week. And so, probably once a month we would do a recording. And then a student came to me who had been listening for years and had just come to the Carver College of Medicine and said, you need to be doing this every week. And I thought, oh, okay. And so we started doing it every week with her help and the help of the other students. And it's been great.
That's awesome. I'm quite new at this. So this is only maybe my second month. So mm-hmm. It's very interesting to hear from other podcasters, like how your idea got started and things like that. When you started, did you envision the podcast being for medical students, patients, everyone? Like, did you have a specific audience in mind?
I did. I thought it was going to be I thought medical students would be the audience. Mm-hmm. And they are to some extent. But it turns out that I hadn't really considered the interest that pre-meds would have in the show. And, with the benefit of hindsight, that makes complete and total sense. I mean, pre-meds are obviously going to be hungry for information about, insight into what medical school is like, because that's what they want to do. And so, yeah, I think one of the most important things about podcasting is to be flexible and sort of pivot when you realize, that your original vision wasn't quite what you thought it was going to be.
That makes total sense. I know our producer, Sam, thinks that it's great for pre-meds because it looks at like what med school is like and gives good tips for applications and interviews. So it's great that you were able to take that lesson that you learned and kind of pivot and give more insight into things. Yeah,
well, part of it was just learning who was contacting us. Mm-hmm. And the people who usually contact us are pre-meds. And so it was clear, this is who I'm actually reaching for the most part. So
that's true. And one thing that I will say is that you have some pretty interesting titles. So one of your more recent episodes was Liver Bits, Cold Glocks, and the Cancer of Cancer, which is an awesome title. Who comes up with those?
When it comes to production and posting and writing and choosing titles, it's all me. I'm a one-man show. My co-hosts are the people who I think are the people who listeners tune in for, but they're not in medical school. They're med students. They're not in medical school to be podcasters. I've got to be the guy who does the work behind the scenes so that they can go off and study and be awesome doctors. So, that's my job. I do the writing.
That's awesome. And what have you learned aside from being able to pivot? What have you learned through hosting and producing the podcast?
Well, I think the biggest thing I've learned is that, medical students are awesome. They're such wonderful people. They're aside from just being, smart, they're creative and they're funny and they have a strong desire to do good in the world. And that's sort of coupled with the fact that they are not yet jaded by their work in medicine. Medicine's a tough discipline. It's not uncommon for, people to get burnt out. And while burnout is definitely a thing in medical school, at this point, they're still very excited to be learning and to, sort of, as one student put it to me, feel their brains changing. And that's exciting. I've also learned that medicine is a huge discipline. I mean, you can be whatever you want to be in medicine. If you want to be a medical journalist, you can do that. If you want to teach, no problem. If you want to serve your fellow humans, you want a life of service, you can do that. If you want to make gobs of money as a specialist, you could do that too. But the respect and social standing that comes with being a physician is a force that can be used for good beyond treating patients. And that's really neat.
That totally is. Like that's a great point in bringing up. You have this passion and this gift to help people as a doctor, and you can use it in different ways. And of course, lots of people are going to go and see patients, and that's wonderful. And like that is the purpose of being a doctor. But you can also tap into those other interests and utilize your skills that you learned in school to give in other ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
In addition to hosting and producing your Short Coats podcast, you're also involved in the Humanities program at Iowa Carver. What does your involvement look like there?
So me and my colleague, Kate DeRouen, are here to support medical students in their, our primary purpose is to support them in their medical writing and in their professional writing. So, we'll help them with their personal statements that they have to write for residency applications or scholarships. We'll help them, with their, say their research paper, all kinds of things. But we'll also help them, with their personal writing and their personal artistic endeavors, and whether that's visual art or performance or, whatever kind of art that they do, we want to help them do that. So Kate does electives, literature electives. We have an art club that meets during lunch once a month. We have an Examined Life literary journal, and we have an Examined Life conference that we do once a year.
That's awesome. It seems like there are so many outlets for the students to participate. And you mentioned that there are specific courses for the writing and helping with the personal statements and things like that. How does Iowa Carver implement these into the curriculum?
Sure. So we have our Medicine and Society strand of courses explores many of the topics in the humanities that are relevant to medicine. And so I guess we should back up and say, sort of what is the role of humanities in medical education? And I think that whether you're talking about visual art or writing or performance or ethics or cultural anthropology or philosophy, all those things are about understanding the human condition. And the human condition is so important to the study of medicine. Studying the humanities means understanding the stories that we tell ourselves and others, because those stories express who we are and how we perceive the world around us. And doctors are dealing with people. Those people have those stories inside them that they use to see the world. And understanding what they are means that they can broaden their viewpoint to include this, physicians can broaden their viewpoint to include not just the science, but an understanding of how those stories interact with patient care and how physicians and how they should understand their role with the patient. Maybe I should give an example. It's important, for instance, in this particular moment and always that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have no reason to trust doctors. Doctors haven't given these people much reason to, not fear them. Medicine has treated them terribly. For instance, women of color have worse childbirth outcomes than white women because of institutional racism, or the fact that, people of color have historically been treated as unconsenting research subjects for the advancement of the health of white people. So when we puzzle over why outcomes are worse for these groups, if we don't understand these conditions, if we don't understand their stories, then they'll never understand why their outcomes are worse and how to fix it. And I guess the other thing I would say about that is that I've heard the statistic, something like 2/3 of human disease has underpinnings in societal factors. And so we need to understand those factors, those stories, and that's where the humanities comes in.
I love that you highlighted that because it is important. Like culture is an important part of medicine. We do learn the body and the disease processes and things like that, but you need to understand the human experience. So like you said, people of color have mistrust. why do they have mistrust for all of the things plus more that you've mentioned? Like I'm a Black woman, for those that don't know that are listening, and like my ancestors were experimented on, and there were things like the Tuskegee experiment and many other ones. And so when people look for doctors, especially like older people who have experienced the past and are even more close to it, and as we are seeing in 2020, it's still going on. We may wonder why a person doesn't want to disclose all of their information to a doctor, or why they're asking specific questions, or they're non-compliant. But you have to understand the history so that you can build those relationships and try to mend them.
Yeah, non-compliance is one of those, sort of triggering words for me. Like, so I should be clear. I'm not a doctor, right? All I know is what I've picked up on from talking with my co-hosts and colleagues in the College of Medicine. But when I hear compliance, that's one of those words that triggers me a little bit, right? Because often the reason people aren't compliant is because they're not able to be compliant because of their situation, because of their stories, because of their lives. And so that's one of those things that we need to understand.
Absolutely. Like, you have to understand where a patient is to meet them. And it shouldn't be a state of compliance, because that's more of a paternalistic thing of telling someone, why didn't you listen to what I told you to do? But if you ask, okay, why didn't you take your blood pressure medicine? Oh, you may learn that they may not be able to afford it, or they lost their job, or they had to choose between taking this prescription and feeding their children, or they may live in a food desert where there may not be vegetables and canned foods and things like that may also be affecting their health conditions like hypertension and other things. So we have to learn where our patients are in order to meet them there, or see how we can even help them.
Yeah, exactly. Or even, what part of their story is going to affect how they perceive my advice, and how can I deliver my advice or my diagnosis or my treatment so that they will understand and be happier to participate given what I know about them.
That makes perfect sense.
So do you feel like medicine does a good job of this these days?
To be honest, I don't.
Yeah.
And I think that we're starting to understand a lot more about it. But we are coming from an altruistic state of medicine where it was more paternalistic to say, okay, this is what I'm a doctor, this is what I told you to do it. Where now, thankfully, I think more in the newer generation of physicians, we are trying to build partnerships. So for instance, I trained in family medicine, and at my family medicine program, shout out to University of Maryland, did community medicine, where we were kind of submerged into the community. Like, we had stores and we were in the neighborhoods of Baltimore. And there we took a look and we learned about like what is affecting our patients. Why are they this way? Looking at the social determinants of health and things that our patients actually needed, going into the community and doing home visits to see how our patients are actually living, and trying to bring that back and discuss whether or not it was through our group balance with our teams or on our grand rounds, like how can we integrate more with the culture and the environment surrounding us to learn about our patients. And I think that more and more programs are doing that out there in medical schools as well. I went to Boston University for medical school, and we also had a humanities program where we're thinking about these kinds of things. And I think the more that we expose the newer future physicians to that, the more they'll spread that on. So for instance, when like I'm an attending now, so when I was practicing in my brick and mortar office and I had students come and visit, we would have these discussions and talk about patients, and not just rattle off, okay, this patient is non-compliant, they don't want to take their medicines, but dig deeper into why, and like, who is this person? Like, not being a number, like, oh, that hypertensive patient over there. No, Miss Bertha, what's going on with Bertha and her family today? And getting to know people.
Yeah.
So I think that as we make small steps in that direction and take a look at what's going on, we can change the future and try to figure out different things. And now, especially with all of the uprisings and racial conversations that are going on in 2020, it brings us even closer to taking a look at our organizations and seeing like, why do we have these healthcare disparities? And what can we do as physicians to build that trust and to help change it for the future? Not just say, okay, we recognize that the mortality rate of Black mothers is more than white mothers, but why? And how can we change that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are built to take shortcuts, mental shortcuts. And I think one of the things that the study of humanities when it comes in its intersections with medicine can do is provide you with a framework to recognize when you're taking a shortcut and then figure out what to do about it. And I think that's really important. So, you asked about the curriculum. And, so we have a medicine and society strand of courses. It's a 3-course strand that explores many of the topics like the social determinants of health and the impact of culture and community on healthcare. So that's a big part. And, right now, my colleague Kate is teaching an elective right now that's exploring systems of power in medicine, which relates directly to some of the things we've already talked about, but also exploring, the hierarchies, the status hierarchies in medicine and how those affect training and the feedback that you get and the kinds of feedback that you're willing to give and how that might affect your career and just all kinds of different effects that those status hierarchies have. So I sat in on one of Kate's classes the other day where we talked with a medical anthropologist, Tanya Jenkins. And this was her work, studying the status hierarchies in medicine. And there are so many ways that these, hierarchies affect medicine and how it's practiced. Everything from, maybe you've noticed, when you go into a meeting that includes, people like yourself who are attendings and then residents and fellows and medical students. She pointed out something that I found interesting called the chair hierarchy. Do you know what have you heard that expression?
No.
So this is the hierarchy that seems to happen. This is the thing that seems to happen when a big group of people go into these meetings, and some people are allowed to sit at the table and other people are allowed to sit at the outside of the room. And even within those sections, there are people who are allowed to sit at the head of the table and people who are allowed to sit along the sides. And it's kind of subtle, but at the extreme ends, you can see it. Like the medical students would never sit at the table. For instance, the physicians, the attendings would always sit at the table. And this happens to a greater or lesser extent, depending on where you are and what kind of system you're working in. But I thought, that's so interesting, and these are things that nobody ever talks about. Nobody ever says, well, you're a med student, you got to sit over here. It's just what you know. And I find that really interesting.
I now, I've never really thought of it in that manner when you use those words, but I definitely can reflect back to when I was a student and things in how certain rooms are set up in certain rotations. And if no one warned you, you might go and sit at the table and maybe have a interesting conversation with your resident or something afterward.
Yeah.
About, never do that again.
Yeah.
But hopefully, as we're becoming more aware of teams-based systems and opening up to more ways to interact with one another, we can slowly break down those barriers. Because personally, I think that it's crazy that there's a hierarchy in a seat, but unfortunately that's the way it is in medicine.
Yeah, it's, Tanya Jenkins pointed out in this class, some of these, there are good reasons for some of these things, right? There are legal reasons why, say, that the physician is higher up than many nurses in the hierarchy because the physician has legal authority, legal responsibility for some parts of the patient's care, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, that kind of makes sense. But, so they're not all bad. It's just something to watch out for. And of course, that's an aspect of humanity.
Yes.
So
I find it so fascinating.
Yeah.
You mentioned that some students do writing, some students do art.
Yeah.
What are some interesting examples of humanities activities that Carver students do?
I think they do even more than we think they do, because there are so many times when I've been talking to a student that's, that participates actively in the program, and we hear the name from them, the name of a student who we've never met before. and that they're doing, painting or photography or this, that, or this. So they're doing something outside of our, knowledge. I think that there are a lot of people doing a lot of things that we don't even know about. But for instance, sculpture, pottery, as I said, photography, painting, lots of painters, dance is another one we hear about, things like that. I mean, they're doing all kinds of stuff.
That's great.
Yeah. And I think it's neat. I think, we can even expand that to include people who are, social justice warriors, people, so all these people who come into med school with these passions and these identities. And I think the last thing we want for them is for them to give up those identities in favor of studying medicine. I mean, that'd just be lame. You'd just be, boring as a person. Not to to just.
I totally agree. I always tell everyone that I can, like, being a physician is a component or a small part of who you are, but it does not define who you are. So you need to figure out ways and interests and hobbies that make you you and make you unique and give you joy and something else to look forward to each day.
Yeah, I always tell students, when they if they'll listen to me, I always tell them, don't give up that which makes you you. Medical education will, not intentionally, but will give you the impression that the only thing that you are allowed to do is study medicine. And, that's a terrible way to go. It can create all kinds of problems for you, emotionally and physically, and just make you, it can stunt you, I think.
Absolutely. Like from a lot of, just for the students listening out there, I think that Dave just shared some wonderful words of wisdom with us, because I definitely have friends and colleagues out there where if you get to a point where it's time for a career change, or you have the quote unquote burnout experience, and a lot of people seem to reflect and wonder what they can do next. And they're always like, well, all I know about is how to be a doctor. And that's totally not true. Like, of course, your intentions, and you studied a long time, and you'll continue to learn each day, because the day that you stop learning is the day that you should quit being a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
But there's way more to life than just medicine, and you all have specific, unique gifts.
Absolutely. And those gifts, shouldn't be looked at in isolation. They make you a better person and a better physician. That's the whole point of the Writing in Humanities program at the Carver College of Medicine. It's an acknowledgement that these things make you better than you would otherwise have been if you just decided to discard those things.
Absolutely. Does your podcast contribute to the humanities program at all at Carver?
Well, I mean, I hope so. We explore the social aspects of medicine, the human condition aspects, in part because, I find that more interesting. As a non-scientist, as a non-physician, I find that more interesting. But also just as an acknowledgement that we're not content experts yet, and anything we said about medicine would probably be incorrect. We do it in a much less formal way than some other ways that the college explores the humanities, though. For instance, one of the popular exercises that med students do is to engage in reflective writing about what it is they're becoming, which is great. I don't know if it's for everybody. And so, maybe the podcast offers a way to do that reflection every week in a way that's, a little less intimidating than writing. I also hope that the podcast offers co-hosts an idea about how they might be public figures in medicine someday. I think traditionally doctors and scientists have sort of stayed in their own lane and didn't get involved in public discourse very much. And I think many have felt that the best use of their knowledge and skills was to care for their patients. And I think that's evolving. I think medicine has become intensely political in recent years. And so I hope that my co-hosts will see podcasting as a way to incorporate those skills and that knowledge that they have into a public discussion on medicine and healthcare and how it affects and is affected by the world that they live in and that they work in. I mean, maybe exert their influence in a way that has a positive effect.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that medicine is becoming more political, which it is. Do you feel personally that there is a place for politics in medicine? I
don't think it matters whether there's a place or not. I think that it's there. Politicians are making decisions about medicine that affect their patients directly and affect the physicians themselves directly. And so, whether there's a place in medicine or not is irrelevant. You have to participate.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you. Medicine is political. Healthcare is a political issue, whether or not you agree that it should be or not. Although I personally think that healthcare is a human right.
Mm-hmm.
We have not gotten there yet.
Yeah.
In the U.S. So you have to use your voices to stand for what you believe in that is correct and right, and what will help benefit your patients. So use your voices and the power that you have to take a stand and advocate for yourself and your patients and your community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, do it in small ways, do it in big ways, just do it and participate and be part of the process, because it's going to happen whether you want it to or not.
I've really enjoyed talking with you today, and I feel like we learned so much about your podcast and the behind the scenes things of that. It's always great to talk to other podcasters, and a lot about the role of humanities in medical education and how it's implemented at Iowa Carver. Do you have any last words of wisdom or any other things that you would like to mention before we part ways?
Yeah, no pressure. I don't. Just always bring your A game, but leave some for yourself. Leave some time for yourself and some energy for yourself. And don't give up what makes you you. Just be awesome.
And I applied the pressure, but I think that you handled things well under pressure, because those were amazing points.
I appreciate that.
So it's so great to have you.
Thank you.
I guess we'll say bye now.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And for everyone listening, I'll see you next week.
Each episode of the Prospective Doctor podcast is brought to you by Med School Coach. To access articles, videos, webinars, and free tools to help you succeed on your journey toward med school and beyond, visit our website, prospectivedoctor.com. We hope you tune in again next time.